Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Ask the Gluten-Free Chef. I'm your host, Calvin, and I'm here to answer your questions about celiac disease, gluten-free living, and gluten-free eating. To learn more information on how you too can live a simple, happy, and healthy gluten-free lifestyle, follow my food blog at theglutenfreechefblog.com or follow me on Twitter at glutenfreechef5 and like me on Facebook at the Gluten Free Chef blog by Calvin Eaton. We're also found on Stitcher, and you can also review and like this podcast over at iTunes. Let's jump right into this week's episode. So welcome to this week's episode of Ask the Gluten-Free Chef. I'm glad you are here with me, and I'm just really excited to be doing this podcast. I have been celiac, of course, if you've listened from day one, for a few years now, but it never ceases to amaze me the questions that are sent in and just the types of things that I am asked, just in general, as a celiac foodie, for as prevalent and prominent as the gluten-free lifestyle has become over the last couple years. There are still many people who just don't know a lot about gluten and what it is and what it's not, and I'm always getting asked questions by people who are not necessarily, who don't have a celiac diagnosis, but individuals who just are really unclear and not sure what gluten means and what it doesn't mean. So I say that to say that I'm just really happy to be doing this work and to be answering your questions each and every week. And with that being said, I wanted to just delve right into this week's question. This is a very, again, I don't know, I feel like every week I say this is a very common question. And it's so funny because so many questions that people have are common. These are the questions that I'm asked all the time when I bake, for people who are not gluten-free, and even for those who are new to the illness, they just are not quite sure. So this week's question, what flours are best for gluten-free baking, is again one of those simple on the surface questions, but very loaded because there's no one clear answer to the question, what types of flours are best for gluten-free baking. I think just my experience thus far being a baker and having developed recipes for the last few years, I always have found that when you're doing gluten-free baking, you really have to just remove every single thing that you know about baking from your mind. If you are someone who likes to bake, you know how much of a science baking can actually be just in general, and a lot of times it may take a lot of trial and error to get a recipe to perfection when you create a new recipe, and that's why for most of us it's just so much easier to build or adapt recipes from online or using other cookbooks where people have already done all of the trial and all of the error for you, and so you don't have to waste your time, energy, and effort on botching baked goods when you bake them and it just doesn't turn out the way you wanted it to turn out. But for someone like myself who's a foodie, I love the trial and error part of baking and just playing around with different types of ingredients and really building a baked good, whether it be a cookie or a sweet bread or some type of a quick bread, from start to finish, and just really analyzing what I'm using, taking measurements. I really had to teach myself over the years to be patient when it came to gluten-free baking, just because measurement really counts. I mean, measurement always counts when you're baking in general, but it's especially with gluten-free baking, measurement counts, and making sure that you're being accurate with your measurements. I tend to use volume-based measurements, so I use cups and teaspoons, and I don't tend to use weight measurements. I don't do a lot of weighing with a scale, but I know that just in general, most bakers or most professional bakers always say that when you're baking, you should be using or weighing your ingredients or weighing your flours. And I don't want to get too far off on this tangent, but I'll just say that, someone living with a chronic illness, I do love to bake and I love to cook, but at the same time, I don't always have a lot of energy to do those things. And so usually, especially when I'm recreating or making a recipe that I've already tried and tested and it's pretty much foolproof, I like to pretty much get in and get out of the kitchen, do what I have to do with my ingredients, get everything whipped up, and get my bread or my cake or my cookies into the oven so that I can sit down really sometimes, because I don't necessarily always have a lot of energy to spend hours upon hours in the kitchen. But at the same time, I've learned how to be quick, but also at the same time be efficient with my baking. And so I attributed that a lot to the baking that I did in my bakery that I owned for almost a year. So with that being said, the types of flours that are best for gluten-free baking, there's really no specific type of flour. I think just with anything, it goes back to your taste, your preferences, being a baker, being a foodie if you are. But if you're someone who doesn't like to bake a lot, this will be really beneficial for you to listen to, because I'm just going from my experience being a recipe creator and being a recipe developer and being a baker and having owned a professional bakery. I always found that the baked goods that always come out to be the best are the ones that I use several different types of flours for. So what that means is that usually when you're building a gluten-free baked good, you're not going to use one particular flour. When you bake with wheat flour, usually recipe that says, it may say like 2.5 cups of flour, 3 cups of flour, or a cup and a half of flour, you're using wheat. And the beautiful thing about wheat is that it has a lot of different properties. That gluten, that protein at the molecular level of that grain of wheat is really what when you do different types of things to it, it gives you different types of textures. So for instance, when wheat flour reacts with yeast for like a yeast bread, it helps the dough rise. It helps to give, a French roll or fluffy baked bread. It gives it that chew, that pull that you're used to. And when you're baking gluten-free, especially when you're baking gluten-free bread, you're not using gluten, you're not using wheat, so you have to find flours that have the same properties that the wheat flour attributed or gave to that baked good, whether it be the crisp for a cookie or the moistness for a cake or a cupcake. When you take the gluten out, when you take the wheat out, you're removing that. So when you build or adapt a recipe to be gluten-free, you have to learn the properties that you need for that baked good that you have to replace using gluten-free flours. So for the most part, my disclaimer is always, when you're baking gluten-free, you're going to want to look for recipes that call for multiple or two or more flours, really. So, for instance, the all-purpose flour blend that I created has about 4 or 5 different flours in it. The flours that I love for my all-purpose flour blend are rice flour, white rice flour, or brown rice flour. It has tapioca starch in it, a little potato starch, and it has xanthan gum in it as well. Xanthan gum is what you're replacing to your gluten-free blend, that binds the flour, that pulls it all together so that it doesn't have like a gritty consistency or texture. That's what xanthan gum gives. That's the property that it gives to the all-purpose flour blend. And speaking on the all-purpose flour blend, whether you create it yourself from a recipe that you can find, I have an all-purpose flour blend recipe on my blog, theglutenfreechefblog.com, or if you're buying a pre-done mix, look at the ingredients that your mix contains. The ones that for me taste the best, that replicate that taste of wheat the best in the baked good, are ones that use white rice flour, tapioca starch, potato starch, and xanthan gum. Those are the 4 that I use for my all-purpose flour blend. I know that some all-purpose flour blends like Bob's Red Mill and some others also add chickpea flour. I'm not a huge fan of the taste or the smell of chickpea flour in my baked good. It does have, at least in my opinion, a pretty pronounced or prominent taste, and I can taste it in the final baked good, especially if it's a cake that is not like a spice cake or a chocolate cake where you're going to be getting those flavors masks. If it's like a white cake or something like that, if that all-purpose flour blend contains chickpea flour, that chickpea flour is going to really shine through when you taste your final product. So for that reason, I tend not to use a lot of chickpea flour in my recipes. That's not to say that chickpea flour is not great. It's just that I personally have not used it a lot in my baking, and I don't find it to be the best flour. But I'm sure, as with all things cooking and baking, there are probably some awesome recipes out there that utilize chickpea flour, but that's just not one that I use a lot. And really all the flours that I'll mention in this podcast for, what are the best flours for gluten-free baking are the ones that I use a lot. Some other types of flours or starches that I use for baking. I do a great banana bread that is a combination of gluten-free oats. It has cornmeal and cornstarch as the base. So what I do is I kind of pulse all of those together. Obviously, I'm not giving you the amounts in the podcast, but just the ingredients themselves, I pulse them together to create the flour base or the dry base for my baked good. And that's really what it's all about when you're baking gluten-free and you're using different types of dry ingredients as a supplement to your wheat flour. Pretty much anything can be milled down into a flour. White rice flour is milled or pulsed. It's milled or pulsed rice. The same with cornstarch. Anything that's dry, you can make fava bean flour, you can make black bean flour. If you pulse it down using a food processor or a miller, you can make a powder or a flour from that ingredient for the most part. Another one that I use a lot, or maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but that I use in some of my baked goods is coconut flour. Now again, I don't use coconut flour usually with coconut flour because it absorbs moisture at a high rate or a high level. Usually when you're adding coconut flour to a gluten-free blend for a base, whether it's a cookie or a cake, usually the coconut flour is, again, maybe the third dry flour in that blend. And because coconut flour has such a high absorption rate, meaning that you don't have to use a lot of it in relation to the liquid measure for that recipe, you don't usually have to use a lot of coconut flour in a particular recipe. I bake it's a pretty good coconut sugar cookie that uses coconut flour as one of the ingredients, and I think it's only about 1/4 of a cup of coconut flour in relation to the other flours that are in the recipe. Coconut flour has a very high absorption rate, and that's good to note because the mistake that most people make when they're baking with gluten-free flours is that, and if you haven't listened to this podcast or don't know, a lot of people, they'll go out and buy a bag of coconut flour, which is gluten-free, of course, and they'll use the coconut flour as a cup-for-cup replacement in a baked good. So let's say that you're trying to bake like a cake, and the cake calls for 3 cups of regular wheat flour or cake flour. You go out, you buy your bag of coconut flour, and you say, okay, I'm going to adapt my recipe gluten-free and use 3 cups of coconut flour for this cake. You will find that if you do that, your cake will be a mess. It will not taste well because you can't use coconut flour as a cup-for-cup replacement for wheat flour. It just does not work that way. It has different properties than the wheat flour does. Like I said, it has a very high absorption rate, so that's why you always, typically when you're baking gluten-free, using gluten-free flours and blending them, you're going to use 2 or more flours at the least because the properties of gluten-free flours are so different from the properties of wheat flour. That's the same when it comes to almond flour or almond meal, tapioca starch, potato starch, which is a little different from potato flour. So just the properties and the chemistry of food really comes into play when you're baking with gluten-free flours and you're trying to find what gluten-free flours work best for you and for your cooking or baking. And really, a lot of it is trial and error if you're trying to create or adapt a recipe on your own. For most people who are not bakers or who may not love to bake, it's always best to go online and to find recipes that have already been adapted and kind of tested for you already, so that you don't waste your time and energy and feel like you're wasting all of your time on recipe development. But for those of us like myself who think that it's fun, again, this can be a fun process. But I would be dishonest if I didn't say that when you bake, when you take the time to create a recipe, or when you're developing a recipe and it doesn't come out on the first try, that feeling of devastation, it happens to me as well. I can't say that it doesn't. Usually I'm pretty much a perfectionist and I like things to come out the first time. And so a lot of times I feel very guilty when I bake something, or I don't know if I want to call it guilt, but I feel some kind of way, I guess I'll put it the way I'll put it, when I bake something or try a recipe or develop a recipe and it doesn't come out on the first try. I always feel like a failure, and I feel like, oh my goodness, I've wasted all these ingredients and it didn't come out right. It's not edible. It's too hard. It's a mess. The texture is gummy or what have you. But that's just the fun, and in playing around with different types of flours and recipes and different types of ingredients. I know that some gluten-free flours contain soy flour. There is black bean flour that people use for certain gluten-free baked goods like brownies. I would say that a black bean flour would be best suited in like a recipe. I'm sorry, a fudge recipe or a chocolate based recipe, because again, black beans have a pretty strong flavor, and you'd want to mask that in your final baked good. So something that you might bake with black bean flour would probably be something that's more chocolate based or spice based, where you're going to mask that black bean taste in your final baked good. I'm trying to think of some other ones that I like to use. So far I've mentioned tapioca starch, white rice flour, um, you know, brown rice flour, which is similar to white rice flour. It's just that the outer portion of the grain of rice has not been extracted, so that's why they keep the husk, is what it's called, on the grain of rice, and they don't take that off. So that's why you get the brown rice flour from that. Cornstarch, cornmeal. I know that for some people there is some contention or just some feelings about using too much corn in your baked goods. I know that there are some people who are sensitive to corn, so you might not use corn flour or cornstarch or cornmeal in your baked goods, and that's fine. I know you can buy organic, non-GMO cornstarch or cornmeal or corn flour. Those are a little bit more expensive than your standard cornstarches or your standard cornmeal or your standard corn flours, and I think that's a personal choice again. And those are really the ones that I use the most in my recipes. I know that, again, mentioning some others, chickpea flour is one that's common. Soy flour is another one that's common. I've seen pea flour. I have not used some of those ones. I do use almond meal. I do use almond flour, and I do also use coconut flour in my baked goods. And what I wanted to do this year, one of the things that I had on my goals, was to develop more recipes that utilize almond meal and almond flour, because almond meal and almond flour, they follow that paleo model, or paleo model, as most people like to pronounce it as. Paleo is grain free completely. So when you're eating paleo, you're going to be using a lot more almond meal, almond flour, and you know almonds in your baking. And I know that there is some debate on whether using almond flour or almond meal is really more healthy than some other types of grain-free ingredients. And I don't think I'll get into that debate in this podcast. What you might do is just do your own research on almond meal and almond flour. Of course, if you're someone who's allergic to peanuts or tree nuts, then you wouldn't be able to use almond flour. But one website that's a great source of information on recipes that use, for the most part, all almond-based flours and meals is elenaspantry.com. And Elena is a paleo specialist, I guess I'll call her, and she has a whole website dedicated to almond meal and almond flour recipes and the paleo diet and eating grain-free because that's what works best for her. I take more of a general approach to my gluten-free. I don't say that I'm grain-free because I do use so many other types of grains that are not, that are obviously gluten-free. So again, Elena's Pantry is a great website for recipes that have been tried and tested and that utilize almond meal and almond flour if you're very interested in that. So I hope that I have not rambled on for too much, and I hope that you were able to glean, some information and really get a good sense of where to start when you're looking for the types of gluten-free flours to buy for your gluten-free baking. Just to kind of summarize what we've discussed in this podcast, you want to always be looking for recipes that use 2 or more flours in them. And if you see one that's only 1 flour, that's not to say that it's not a good recipe, but I would just say be careful with it and be prepared to not like the taste of it if it does just utilize one type of flour, just because, like I've mentioned, in my success in gluten-free baking, in my experience, I always find that recipes that have 2 or more flours generally turn out better than ones that only have one type of flour. For more information on recipes that have been tried and tested and that you can just pull right from the internet, you can always find those on my food blog, theglutenfreechefblog.com. I also share a lot of recipes on my Facebook, the Gluten Free Chef blog by Calvin Eaton on Facebook. If you have any other specific questions to specific types of flours, their properties, one book that I like a lot that I think is good is the celiac cookbook, which I have that on my website, a link to that on my website as well. That recipe book really speaks to the properties and more of the chemistry of flours, and I think it's really nice to learn that. The celiac cookbook, which you can find again as a link on my food blog. A lot of recipes in that book are sorghum based. Sorghum is another gluten-free grain that I've started to use a lot. Sorghum has a really nice, it has almost like an earthy smell and texture, and it's really healthy. And so if you want to really dabble into some more of the more healthy, earthy type of grains, really look into sorghum. And again, you can find a link to that on my blog, theglutenfreechefblog.com. For any other questions, again, you can find me also on Twitter at glutenfreechef5, hashtag AskTheGlutenFreeChef. And this is going to wrap up this week's episode, and I look forward to answering your questions next week. Keep your questions coming. AskTheGlutenFreeChef@gmail.com. And you have a great week. Thank you. This is Ask the Gluten Free Chef.